Can we skip to the viral part? I just need the poor me clip. This courtroom's a prop, not a problem.
Sometimes the truth doesn't just whisper, it screams when it is being smothered by a lie. If you've spent any time on the internet lately, you've seen the clips. You've seen the kind judge and the teary-eyed defendant. You've seen justice served with a side of emotional music and a dramatic pause. But what happens when the tears are rehearsed? What happens when the shaking hands are part of a calculated performance designed to bypass the law and go straight for the heartstrings? I've spent years behind this bench, and I've learned that the courtroom is the ultimate stage. People don't just come here to settle a case. They come here to perform a role. They've watched the viral videos. They know the Leo story. They think that if they can look broken enough, wet enough, and desperate enough, the gavel will turn into a magic wand. But tonight, we aren't just watching a trial. We are Boktak decoding the performance of a man who thought he could script his own salvation. Let me set the scene for you. It was a Tuesday morning, similar to the one you remember from the stories that made you cry. The air in the room was heavy, with the smell of wet coats and damp umbrellas. The rain was drumming a rhythmic, relentless beat against the glass, creating that perfect atmosphere for a miracle. The courtroom was full of people looking for a second chance, but they weren't looking for justice, they were looking for an emotional release valve. My clerk, a woman who has seen more calculated performances than a Broadway director, handed me the file for Marcus. She didn't say a word, but she gave me that look. You know, the look that says, "This one thinks he's an Oscar winner." I opened the docket. Speeding, uninsured, expired registration, a carbon copy of the vulnerable orphan narrative that usually triggers a viral wave of sympathy. "Next case," I called out. The door opened, and Marcus walked in. He didn't just walk, he drifted. He was soaking wet, shivering in a way that felt just a little too rhythmic to be purely from the cold. He wore a jacket that was frayed at the cuffs, and he held a worn-out cap in his hands, twisting it with the precision of a man who had practiced that specific movement in front of a mirror. He didn't look at me. He looked at the floor, his shoulders hunched, waiting for the social compass to find him. But here is where the script began to fray. I didn't see a boy trying to be a man. I saw a man trying to be a boy. I saw the emotional Achilles heel, the emotional triggers being pulled one by one, the shivering, the wet hair, the downcast eyes. It was a masterpiece of simulated authority. Most judges would have seen a second chance. I saw a calculated lie. Stay with me, because in the next part, we are going to look at the first exchange the moment I asked Marcus, the one question his script wasn't prepared for. This is where the accountability fantasy ends and the final lesson in truth begins. I said, "State your name for the record," and my voice cut through the performative silence he had so carefully created. Marcus looked up with eyes that were perfectly red-rimmed and spoke in a calculated whisper that seemed designed to make every person in the back row lean in to hear his struggle. He paused for exactly 2 seconds before he spoke, just long enough to let a visible shiver run through his frame so the room could witness his supposed terror. I looked down at the file and saw the reality. Driving 20 miles over the speed limit with no insurance and an expired registration, which in any other context would be seen as a clear threat to public safety. But Marcus wasn't here to present a legal defense. He was here to sell an accountability fantasy. He began a rehearsed monologue about a job interview he couldn't afford to miss and a younger sister who needed shoes, trying to turn the courtroom into a stage for emotional relief rather than justice. He was using every trick in the book to simulate an authority he hadn't earned. He described the rain as a barrier to his very survival, hoping to pull on the emotional triggers of anyone watching. I watched his hands as he twisted his cap, but I also noticed his eyes darting toward the courtroom cameras to see if his performance was landing. He didn't want a fair trial. He wanted a viral moment that would make me the hero and him the victim. I leaned forward and interrupted his script, pointing out that while he claimed to be rushing to a job site, the police report showed him heading in the opposite direction toward the airport. The shivering stopped instantly as the gap between his scripted lie and the cold reality of the report became a chasm. His eyes, which had been full of practiced tears, suddenly turned sharp and calculating as he realized he had missed a critical detail in his own story. Tonight, we aren't just looking at a simple speeding ticket or a boy who made a mistake. We are witnessing what happens when a calculated lie meets a judge who refuses to be a character in someone else's viral dream. The performance was over, and for the first time in that courtroom, the final lesson in truth was about to begin. The silence that followed my question wasn't the heavy, respectful silence of a courtroom. It was the hollow, ringing silence of a broken glass. Marcus stood there, his body still positioned in that practiced hunch, but the rhythm of his shivering had vanished. In that split second, the information gap between the persona he had built and the reality I held in my hand became a physical presence in the room. He had spent weeks studying the viral videos of Judge Caprio, memorizing the emotional Achilles heel, the emotional triggers that usually turn a judge into a father figure. He thought that by mentioning a sick mother and a struggle for survival, he could bypass the law and go straight for the emotional release valve. But Marcus had made the mistake of believing that judicial voice is only about mercy. He didn't realize that my authority isn't just performed. It is earned through a relentless pursuit of the truth behind the mask. I watched as his face underwent a radical transformation. The red-rimmed eyes and the teary-eyed gaze were gone, replaced by a cold, calculating look that I see in men twice his age. He realized that the content gap in his story, the simple detail of which direction he was driving, had collapsed his entire house of cards. This is what happens when fiction feels cleaner than reality. Trust has already collapsed before the first word is even spoken. Marcus wasn't just lying about a destination. He was weaponizing the language of desperation to manipulate the very system meant to protect the truly vulnerable. He had taken the Philomena Fund legacy, the idea that a stranger's kindness can be a miracle, and tried to turn it into a transaction. He wanted me to be the social compass that pointed only toward his benefit, ignoring the danger he posed to every other family on that wet Rhode Island road. I didn't roll the dice with his safety. He had rolled the dice with the lives of everyone else when he chose to drive 20 miles over the limit without a single thought for the consequences. As he opened his mouth to try a new script, I saw the desperation shift from survival to evasion. He was no longer a boy trying to be a man. He was a predator of sympathy, caught in the headlights of a truth he couldn't outrun. The performance was failing, and as the curtain began to fall, the true weight of accountability was finally starting to settle in the room. So, Marcus, the job site was north, but you were heading south, I said, leaning back as the leather of my chair groaned, punctuating the stillness of the room. I watched his eyes scan the gallery, looking for a new exit or a new coup twist that would rescue his fading narrative. He didn't apologize for the lie. Instead, he doubled down on the emotion, reaching for the tu huyet kamsuk of family that he had seen work so many times before on a screen. He started talking about a secret hospital visit, about a mother who was fading away and a sister who was starving, using words designed to paint a picture of a man driven to the brink by a cruel world. It was a performance of emotional justice, a desperate attempt to turn my courtroom into a release valve for his personal failures. But in this courtroom, authority is earned through truth, not simulated through scripted tears. I looked at the bag of tools in the back of his car, tools that were shiny, new, and clearly never used. Unlike the rusty hammers and duct-taped belts of a real apprentice trying to build a life, Marcus was a predator of sympathy, someone who had learned to speak the language of one small mistake, to hide a lifetime of calculated choices. He thought that by performing the role of a second chance, he could escape the final verdict of his own actions. He didn't realize that when fiction feels cleaner than reality, the collapse of trust is inevitable, and my job is to catch the debris. I asked him about those tools, and for a moment, the mask slipped entirely, revealing the calculated lie in its rawest form. He didn't have an uncle waiting for him at a job site. He had a buyer waiting for him at the airport for tools that weren't even his. The information gap was now a canyon, and the social compass was pointing directly at a truth he had spent his whole life trying to outrun. Marcus wasn't a victim of the system. He was a victim of his own belief that everyone else was a character in a movie he was directing. The performance was over, and the democratic cost of his deceit was about to be laid bare in front of the very audience he tried to manipulate. The air in the room didn't just feel heavy, it felt toxic. Marcus tried one last gamble, his voice cracking with a scripted plea as he mentioned his mother's supposedly fading health. A classic pull on the emotional triggers of compassion and loss. He believed that by painting a picture of a dying parent, he could create an emotional fog thick enough to hide the calculated lie of his destination. He was banking on the accountability fantasy, the idea that if his pain was loud enough, the law would become silent. But the information gap was no longer a crack. It was a canyon. I reached for the supplemental report on my desk, the one Marcus didn't think I had. Marcus, you told this court your mother was in the hospital across town, I said, my voice dropping to a tone of cold. Judicial authority. But I have a record here of a call you made from the back of that police cruiser. You weren't calling a doctor. You were calling a buyer at the airport to confirm the price of those borrowed tools. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. The shiny new tools in his trunk weren't a neighbor's loan. They were stolen property, lifted from a construction site just hours before he was pulled over. He had looked at the Leo story and seen a blueprint for a heist, believing he could perform the role of the struggling provider to bypass the U.S. justice system. He wasn't just a traffic violator, he was a thief of empathy, trying to steal the second chance that belonged to people who were actually drowning. Marcus stood before the bench, the red-rimmed eyes now dry and fixed in a dull stare of shock as the final act of his performance collapsed. The red light of his own deceit had finally stopped him, and for the first time in this scripted reality, he had no lines left to deliver. He had played the part of the vulnerable orphan so convincingly that he almost believed his own moral speech. But a courtroom is not a theater for emotional relief. It is a place where the letter of the law must eventually confront the spirit of truth. This is the democratic cost that viral media rarely discusses. When judicial voice is weaponized as a tool for manipulation, the truly desperate are the ones who pay the price. When someone like Marcus uses the emotional triggers of family and starvation to cover a theft, he isn't just cheating the court, he is poisoning the well for every Leo who actually needs a lifeline. He is the reason why, when fiction feels cleaner than reality, trust has already collapsed, and society begins to see every plea for mercy as just another calculated lie. I looked at the prosecutor, who was no longer softening his resolve as he might have in the videos Marcus had studied so carefully. The reality was that driving 20 miles over the limit without insurance was a dangerous act that could have turned an innocent family's mourning into a terrible future. To that, we now added the calculated theft of tools he claimed were his future, an act that proved his authority was simulated, not earned. He wasn't a boy trying to be a man. He was a man who had chosen to be a predator of sympathy. The law is black and white, but your life, Marcus, is 1,000 shades of gray that you have painted into pitch black, I said, feeling the literal and symbolic weight of the gavel in my hand. You came here looking for a release valve for your guilt, expecting me to be a character in your accountability fantasy. But justice is not a script you can write. Justice is about upholding the law to protect the people you were willing to roll the dice against. And tonight, the final verdict will not be determined by your tears, but by your actions. Marcus looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't see a savior who would catch him. He saw a mirror. He had walked into this courtroom hoping to use my mother's legacy, the Philomena Fund, as his own personal release valve for a crime he hadn't even finished committing. He thought that by mentioning a starving sister and a fading mother, he could reach into that envelope of $200 and walk out with a miracle he hadn't earned. But the Philomena Fund isn't an accountability fantasy for predators. It is a sacred investment in the heart of those who truly carry the weight of the world on their shoulders. By trying to steal that lifeline, Marcus wasn't just breaking a traffic law. He was committed a radical act of emotional cruelty against every honest person who stands where he is standing right now. The information gap had closed, leaving Marcus with nowhere to hide his calculated lie. He had rolled the dice with the truth, and he had lost everything. In a world where fiction feels cleaner than reality, it is my duty to ensure that the letter of the law remains a blueprint for order, even when someone tries to turn it into a stage for their own authority as performance. He wanted a second chance without accountability, a verdict without truth, but that is a trap of poverty and character that I will not allow to thrive in this courtroom today. Marcus, you didn't just mess up on a rainy Tuesday. You weaponized human compassion to facilitate a theft, I said, the weight of the gavel feeling heavier than any viral headline could ever describe. The calculated nature of your actions means that mercy here would be a dangerous act against every family you endangered on that road. You wanted to sweep floors and do anything to not drown, but you were already sinking the moment you chose to lie to a social compass that was trying to find a way to help you. Tonight, the final lesson in truth is that your authority was simulated, not earned, and the price of that simulation is the second chance you threw away the moment you chose a script over reality. I am not delaying the inevitable with a continuance because you have proven that you aren't an apprentice of the law. You are an apprentice of the illusion. There is no miracle in an envelope for a thief of empathy. The silence in the courtroom now is different. It is the absolute silence of a stage, after the lights have gone dark and the audience has realized the show was a fraud. Marcus, you stood there waiting for the second chance to fall into your lap like a scripted reward, but you forgot that a calculated lie can never be the foundation for a new life. You didn't just drive an uninsured car, you tried to drive a stolen narrative through the heart of this legal system, believing that my judicial voice was a tool you could manipulate for your own accountability fantasy. You looked at the Leo story and saw an opportunity to exploit compassion, but in doing so, you committed a radical act of theft against every truly desperate person who will stand before this bench tomorrow. I am not giving you a continuance, and I am certainly not reaching for an envelope from the Philomena Fund, because that fund is an investment in the heart of those who struggle, not a release valve for those who deceive. The final verdict today is not just about a speeding ticket or stolen tools. It is about the democratic cost of your performance, which has now become a mirror reflecting the collapse of trust you chose to invite into this room. You wanted a miracle without truth, but justice felt real only when it was anchored in reality, and your reality is a calculated disregard for the safety and the trust of this community. I am imposing the maximum fines, revoking your license, and referring the matter of the stolen tools to the criminal division, because mercy for a predator of sympathy is a dangerous act against the truly vulnerable. You thought this was a courtroom fantasy where the judge always smiles at the end, but you have found a final lesson in truth instead. That authority was simulated, not earned in your heart, and the price of that simulation is the accountability you tried so hard to outrun. You will not drown today because of a small mistake, but because you chose to tie a lead weight of lies around your own neck before you ever walked through those doors. The curtain has finally fallen, and as you are let out, remember that the social compass only works for those who are willing to be honest about where they are standing. Justice is not a scripted moment for the cameras. It is the heavy, unglamorous work of holding a man to the letter of the law when he has proven he has no respect for its spirit. This trial never existed in the way you wanted it to, because justice can't be scripted, and today, the only thing that is real is the weight of the gavel you brought down upon yourself.